Hello and welcome to my channel. My name is David Novak. I have not done a recent reads video in some while, and that is because recently I have been reading two long books. I will talk briefly about them, and then I will talk about what I have read subsequent to that. Now, I would like to go into any of these books in more detail and talk about them in depth, but for this video, I don't think I can. This is my set of Stephen Runciman's History of the Crusades. I love showing it. It's a Folio Society edition and a lovely set of books to read. So just briefly, for somebody who has no history of the period, it was a marvelous introduction. So many historians have claimed that Runciman was their first teller of these tales and that his telling was indelible. And I would accept that. So he has received some criticism that he is not always factually correct, that he perhaps made things up. For somebody like me, a novice who really knows nothing, it was a great place for me to get my feet wet. Now, concurrently with that, I was reading the Gulag Archipelago by Aleksandr Solzhenitsyn. It's in 7 parts, and it's basically a memoir. He tries to encompass more than his personal experience and take into account the experience of other persons that passed through the Gulag system and then exile. He closes with exile. And if you want to learn about Soviet history of the period, it's an okay place to start if you're good with reading this amount of material. I mistakenly went into the project thinking that this was a fictional work, and so I was really looking forward to it, but it's not. It's factual. It's not quite a history. He does try to give you some historical background to things, but the narrative really shines when he discusses his personal experiences. And in all, for the period, I would probably rather have looked at a history. It's a marvelous work in its way. I give the man tons of credit for working under the conditions he did and being able to assimilate all of this material and produce a finished work. It has flaws owing to the conditions under which he operated, or was forced to operate, I should say. And I talked about how this book actually may be the largest, or the larger of the 3. The font is a little bit smaller, and I said I was going to try to eliminate subvocalization and get through it faster. Well, I was not 100% successful in that. I did, however, get through it much faster than the others. I feel that with something which is merely factual information, speeding through the text is not likely to do so much harm. Some other text, a poem perhaps, I don't see that I would dare to do that. Now, booktuber Steve Donahue is a big advocate of eliminating subvocalization, meaning you just read the words without saying them, not even with your lips, but with your mind. You don't say them, you just let the text go through. And what I learned, and what I knew previously from other little attempts to do that, was that it's indeed a possible technique to use, but the one thing that Steve never mentioned and never has mentioned is that in order to read a text without the subvocalization, you have to have a very clear mind. And for the most part, my mind is not that clear. I usually have things going on in my mind. And so then the question is, well, do I sit here and wait for my mind to be clear and then just breeze through it? Or do I just take a stab at it and do the best I can? And I did not, through every page of this book, set that as my focus. But I did kick up my speed a notch. Booktuber Michael K. Vaughan has a video just yesterday, I think, in which he talks about his not reading fast enough. He feels, and discusses some of the trade-offs when you try to go faster. I'll put a link to that and to Steve's channel in the description below, and I'll put a link to anything else that seems pertinent. So it took me 2 months to read this, which I was hoping it would be less than that, but that's how it is. And having made the mistake that that Gulag was a fictional work, then I decided, well, I have to follow it up with a bunch of fiction. And I initially was thinking that I would do 6 books of fiction, or 6 novels, to make up for the 6 books of nonfiction that all of this entailed. However, because the books of fiction seem to be going much more smoothly, I think what I will do, and this is really an anomaly for me, but I think I will give myself, possibly, unless I get bored and want to switch over, and a like window of time to read fiction. So I will set my window for reading fiction as 2 months to balance off the nonfiction that I just read. Now, the first book that I read was called Notes of a Crocodile by Qiu Miaojin, and I'm not sure how to pronounce her name correctly. I heard about this on a very sluggish reader's booktube channel, which of course I will link. And I was excited to learn about this book. The author has become, since her death, a gay icon, if you will, or an icon to the gay community in Taiwan. She was in Taiwan growing up whilst I was there, and she probably was 6 years younger than I. I was there briefly in my early adulthood as I was trying to forestall the inevitability of growing up. And so I was really looking forward to this book because I have not read anything by a Taiwanese author or a Chinese author from Taiwan, as I would have said then. Although in either case, I think the word Taiwanese has kind of changed in its meaning a little bit to what it was when I was there. When I was there, there was a clear distinction between Chinese people and Taiwanese people. Taiwanese people being the ones who came over earlier, 200 years earlier, and then Chinese being the ones who came over with Chiang Kai-shek. Of course, everybody would say, oh, they are Chinese too, you know, and of course they are. But that was generally speaking how the distinction operated back in those days, and I think that has changed. So my mind is still set in the old ways. Now, this book purports to be 8 journals. Let's see if I can show you the contents page. And in reading the book, I see no reason to doubt. There we go. Is that visible? I see no reason to doubt that this is taken from actual journals and was a basically a true story, perhaps with fictionalized embellishments, but I think the story is essentially true. She has another book titled Letters from Montmartre. Both of her books were published posthumously. She committed suicide at the age of something like 26, I think. And I entered into this thinking I was going to feel waves of nostalgia for Taipei, a city in which I spent so much important time of my life. It did not quite work out that way. I found that, yes, while certain places, Lo Si Fo Lu, conjured up memories for me, my geographical sense of the city is not really clear anymore after 40 years. I remember the city as it was, but I would not know exactly how to tell anymore whether a cab driver was cheating me, which I could tell you a story about that, but let me move on to the books. I don't want to make this an endless video. So somewhere in here, she discusses the first 2 notebooks of the 8 and says that they're slightly of a different tenor than those. And what I believe happened was she perhaps, this is mere speculation, perhaps was a compulsive notebook writer and wrote a lot of notebooks. But the story entails a particular relationship, and I would believe that at the beginning of the relationship, perhaps she had not been writing it down, or she perhaps had seen fit at one point to destroy those journals. And so the first 2 journals, or does she call them? No, notebooks, were possibly reconstructions. And I felt a different kind of nostalgia with those first 2 volumes because they pertain to the miracle of meeting another person. So when you're young, you live your life, and when you're old, you live your life. And I think for the most part, we take meeting of other people in sort of by rote. It's just something you do and you don't think about it. But once in a while, and speaking from the vantage point of somebody who has suffered more than 60 years on this mortal coil, once in a while you meet a person where that encounter is not taken by rote, often from the very first instant. It's not a usual occurrence, but it does sometimes happen when you are younger, and it can happen with a person of either sex. And this is what happened to her. She met a young woman and fell in love. And so the rest of the book, the subsequent 6 notebooks detail the story from beginning to end and detail her gradual coming out to herself as a lesbian. And it is a story that is fraught. So some people are born, and I'm talking heterosexual or homosexual inclined people. They are born, they grow up, and they're totally at ease with their own sexuality. They're comfortable with it. She was not. She had a bit of a difficult time with it. I suspect she felt she could save herself somewhat through the writing. I don't think generally that you can save yourself through the writing. But so this brought up a different kind of nostalgia than I expected, which was the nostalgia of being in a intimate relation, if you will, or a personal relation with somebody that is difficult because of one of the parties' mental instability, if you will. In my case, that would be me. It has taken a long time to figure things out a little bit. And so some of the details in here are not pretty. If you are, well, I won't go into any more about that. Let me move on. So I was out of town briefly, and oh, you know, I will link something else, because whilst I was in the hotel room, in order to blot out the sound of the TV, I took a song which she mentions as having played on auto repeat incessantly at one point. So I took that, I found that song on YouTube and played it incessantly so that I would not have to listen to the sound of the television. I did not expect that Solzhenitsyn and this would finish as quickly as they did for me, and I did not bring another book. So I went to the library. My intention was to read this, which was my next book in the queue, so to speak. And the library had it, I thought, and I downloaded it and started reading it. Except, once again, I made another dumb mistake. Instead of this book, which I was really looking forward to, I read this book. And there is a font difference as well, so this is a bigger book by a lot. This is about 350 pages, I think. This at best is 200 pages. And this is the sequel. So I wound up reading the sequel, which was not possibly the best approach to this author. Now, I'd heard about Lynn Harris on BookTube, and I had high expectations for the author. Let me say that I was disappointed and leave it at that. Now, I will tell you a little bit about the book. This is also gay fiction, I guess we would say. Now, this is from that time period, the early 1990s, a plot point that touches on characters, incidentally, is Bill Clinton's election to the presidency. So one of the things that got me was coping with the technology in this. You know, people had cordless phones, and this idea of people going to the airport to meet people at the gate, I've practically forgotten that things like that used to happen. So it's a bit of a dinosaur in that respect. Until I realized that I was reading the sequel, I wondered why there was so much plot matter that was, you know, being covered of stuff that had happened off stage, so to speak. You really don't need to read the first book to read this, but I still believe I would have been better having read his first book, which was self-published, Invisible Life, as opposed to Just As I Am. I don't know if this is the second book, quite possibly, I think, and very often second books are markedly inferior, if you will. I don't know why that is. The first book has the rush of new inspiration, and then the author has to learn how to do it right, and that second book can be kind of a lost period. So this is a romance novel, basically, a romance with soft porn, both of the heterosexual and homosexual variety, though homosexual is the focus. And what can I say about this? It being I only read Barbara Cartland's romance. I read one when I was young, and I did not like it, and I don't like this. I can see why somebody like Cervantes needed to come along and write his big satire about the genre. Somebody should and probably has done so about this. Listen, if you like reading romance, more power to you. But I'm going to speak from my own personal view, which is not more valid than anybody else's. But this is how I see things. Pardon me for the interruption. I'm going to have to learn how to splice these two videos together, or they will be part 1 and part 2. We will see how that goes. I have never spliced a video together. I may be on my way to becoming a booktube professional. So I've been talking about this book, and I'm wondering if it is a earmark of the genre. But the one thing that I noticed about this book right away was that the book is all about affluence. The characters are affluent beyond anything I have ever experienced. At the time that this was going on, briefly, I worked at a law firm. I was a photocopy clerk. And if you put in 2 hours of overtime, you got to have a cab ride home. Well, one of the characters is an actress, a would-be starlet, and on one day she takes 3 different cab rides, and all of the characters take cab rides all the time, and they take airplane flights just on a whim, if you will, which is also something I have never known. So the author is taking great pains to show these people as having great wealth. One of the characters is an attorney. Mind you, he does not talk like an attorney or think like an attorney. But he is able to take 6 months off from his job because he has personal business to attend to, and the office is okay with that. None of these characters is ever actually working except for the would-be starlet. Her job consists of, she's an understudy in Jelly's Last Jam, and things are progressing for her perhaps nicely. And there's a lot of shenanigans as she's trying to forge her career path. So the author took an interesting tack with this. He tells the story in alternating chapters, one told by the male lead, if you will, one told by the female lead, who at one time had a thing, possibly in this book. I found that I was interested in the man's story, and I found the woman's story tedious. So I would finish his chapter, and then it would be, oh, I've got to go through her story. The book is divided into 3 parts, and the first part is about half the book, and then the final 2 parts are a quarter of the book. So it's not very symmetrical. It's lopsided, if you will. And I learned something about this writer's technique. So the first 10 chapters, it's about 40 total, 41, 42, were hard going. And then chapters 10 through 20, I got into it. I really enjoyed it. And if the book had ended there at, say, 200 pages, I would have been delighted. I realized that he is an author who writes with a big plan in mind, and then he moves all of his characters into position so that the things happen that he wants to have happen. he's not an author, the sort of which you often hear talking, oh, I just take my characters and put them and see how they interact with each other. No, he knows how they're going to interact with each other. So he has a Jewish character in there who is explicitly in there for a scene which he has forthcoming. And because of all of this premeditation that goes into the plot, there's not much spontaneity. The characters don't have much life to them. They're just sort of ciphers filling a slot, if you will. But as I say, at the end of the first part, or halfway through, I was quite happy with the book. And if he had just wrapped it up, I would have said, wow, this was a great book. Then part 2 entails a long digression, if you will, involving the death of a friend, well, the dying of a friend. And I didn't understand why he was taking a right turn to that, if you will, until I got into the third part. And then I realized, well, for the events that are happening in part 3, he needed some filler. This happens in theater all the time. You know, you have a costume change going on for a character, and so you have to have something else on the stage while that costume change is going on. Well, for the nature of the story, what was going to happen in part 3, he needed some time to elapse, and so it was filler. Unfortunately, so many of the scenes in this book feel that way. He has a predetermined goal, and he executes his plan masterfully, if you will, if you are in accord with that goal. For me, the idea of romance doesn't perhaps cut it anymore. When I was younger, when this was written 30 years ago, perhaps that would have enthused me a little bit more. I have other thoughts on this, but I want to cut this short, so I will leave it at that. At this point, I doubt that I will read this book, the first one, Invisible Life. After that, I went into the next item on my list, God's Children Are Little Broken Things, and this is a Nigerian author, and it is not a novel. It is 9 short stories. So I'm in the middle of What the Singers Say About Love, which is, I believe, the longest story in the book. So I have about 30 pages left to go or so. And if Runciman was the greatest nonfiction that I've read in a long time, these books, where did I put What's Her Face? Oh, well, I don't have it here. Oh, there it is. Sorry, the interruption discombobulated me. This book, I told you about the first 2 chapters, which really enthralled me. The remaining 6 chapters were a mess, pretty much. Not without interest, but a mess. As I say, if you've been or known somebody in extreme circumstances mentally, it's a worthwhile read, perhaps. This, not at all. As I say, the characters have no real issues. Even though lip service is paid otherwise, none of the characters have any issues at all with their sexuality. This lead character certainly did. And in this book, you find issues coming up. Not perhaps as yet any character experiencing great revulsion, if you will. But these are more complicated characters. The second story had a line, a character said, he was not sure if he felt the same way. He'd begun recently to think that the forces of life were capricious and fickle. Why, he wondered, did some people spend their lives struggling to scrape by while others wallowed in abundance? So while this book is not much more than a hankering after abundance, this book actually has characters who think and feel and can philosophize a bit upon the situation in which they find themselves. This book is terrific. It's a winner. It's the culmination of everything. I plan to read one more by her. As I say, I doubt that I will go back and pick this up unless somebody can give me a good argument that I should do so. I suspect it's better than the sequel. But this book, this is the kind that makes me gnash my teeth that this is his debut work. I wish there were several others that I could go and I would immediately plunge into them. It's been a year for short stories for me, I guess, because I read Night of the Living Rez earlier. And before that, I read something by Chestnut, the Conjure Man, or Conjure Woman. Yeah, Conjure Man was a different book I read. And I'm really enjoying the short stories. Now, I'm not going to say that the stories are uneven. I don't really feel that they are. But they appeal to me in different respects or different levels. So of the 9, 2 really stand out for me. The title story is a story titled God's Children Are Little Broken Things. The one before that is Where the Heart Sleeps, which pertains to a death and the ramifications of that death. And the story immediately following that is called Alobam, and it pertains to a friendship. I just Googled the word, and it means something to the effect of loyalty in friendship, extreme loyalty in friendship. And it details a scenario of that sort, and it's a story that is complicated because you have to know this person, and then you have to know this person's past, and then the other person that one hung out with. It's very complex and complicated, and he pulls it off, and you follow the whole thing, and you're riveted to the story. So that's how this book is going. I have 2.5 stories left, and let me just read you a little piece from it that I thought was nice. Ralu remembered how he stayed awake long after Obam had rolled away deep in sleep, how he'd stared at the ceiling, at the fan that stood motionless in the gentle morning light, how he'd gone to stand by the window, listening to the lone tenor chanting Allahu Akbar. A few seconds later, St. Rita's bell started tolling, sonorous and majestic in the gaping silence of early morning. The muezzin's voice continued, almost sad in its abundant tremolos. Ralu's face was cool with the after-rain breeze. The years he had spent going to university in Auca, he had risen on many mornings, longing for that duet of man and bell. It was what he'd missed the most about Kanu, after the people, and yet he knew that when he returned, they would be there, the minaret and the belfry, the streets, the convoluted interconnections of main roads and alleyways, shortcuts he knew like rhymes from childhood intimately. It is beautiful prose, and you will not find anything of the sort in this guy's shit. Pardon my expletive. So high regards for this. I don't tell people what to do. As I say, if you like reading something like this, more power to you. This is to my speed, and the issues brought up are all over the place. A lot of them dealing with being gay in Nigeria, in a society where such a status is not generally expressed openly in most circumstances, at least at the times depicted in this set of stories. The guy is such a good craftsman, I have to say. Another booktuber recently was talking about how he despises when an author will write dialogue but does not put the little quotation marks around it. Some of the stories he uses the quotation marks, and others he doesn't, and this tells you why you don't need that. The use of quotation marks is a relatively modern introduction into language, and if something is well written, you don't need that kind of punctuation. You know, Chinese nowadays uses all of that kind of punctuation, but until fairly recently they didn't. And I'm sure a lot of other languages are in that suit. I mean, the Western quotation marks have been adapted by other languages as they are written, but they are really not necessary. And if you read anything old like Homer, your translation may well have quotation marks and all of that, but they are doubtless interpolations by the editor or the translator. I will leave it at that.